Okay, well, we'll resume the hearing now. Inspector Aston, you had some follow-up questions, I think, just on the points we were discussing before the break.
Yes, I did. There were just some follow-up points on heritage, and then I think what we'll do is I'll ask those, and then that will give some of those just a further few minutes to digest the statement of common ground, and then perhaps we can wrap that up in a moment. So obviously we'll talk a bit more about the main modifications that are proposed in the statement of common ground, but just kind of for our purposes, added to the at-risk register in 2015 due to long-term effects of divided ownership resulting in different landscape kind of management, lack of a coherent site-wide strategy for conservation and ongoing management, impacts on views, such things as the lake's condition. And what I'm interested in is views on whether the allocation would address the view that there's a fragmented management of the heritage assets. That's the first thing. Secondly, is how does the site allocation provide a positive strategy towards addressing the reasons why Wimbledon Park is on the Heritage at Risk Register, of enhancing access to and enjoyment of heritage assets as required by the MP.
Looks like we've lost Inspector Aston. We'll wait for him to come back in, but yeah, so I mean, taking that first part of his question first, so there's that fragmented ownership. So would the allocation relate to that? And then thinking about what the framework says in terms of positive strategy in terms of the historic environment. I'll just have a look at my copy of it while we're waiting for Inspector Aston to come back in. So paragraph 190 of the framework plan should set out a positive strategy for the conservation and enjoyment of the historic environment, including heritage assets most at risk through neglect, decay or other threats. And obviously we're going to talk at stage 2 more generally in terms of how the plan responds to that aspect of the framework, but particularly in terms of this site, be useful for your views on how that allocation would help with that.
Inspector, would you like to continue, or should we wait a moment for Mr. Aston?
Apologies, I'm not entirely sure what happened there. Did I just cut out?
I think you cut out just before you started asking about. I think was it a question sort of related to paragraph 190 of the framework, where it talks about what planning policies should seek to achieve in terms of a positive strategy for conservation and enjoyment.
Thank you, Inspector Fort. Yeah, so we just want to explore this issue about whether the allocation would address the view of there being a fragmented management of the heritage assets, and how the allocation provides a positive strategy towards addressing the reasons why it's on the Heritage at Risk Register. So if we deal with those 2 points first, I'll just ask Ms. Butler for her view, please.
Thank you, Inspector. As set out in our hearing statement on page 7, starting at paragraph 1430, yes, we believe that the site allocation addresses paragraph 190 of the MPPF. It's paragraph 14.31 quotes from the site allocation, which says that the allocation will secure investment in the former golf course to invest in, and I am adding the modification with historic England here, and conserve and enhance the historic landscape and secure pedestrian and cycle access to areas of formerly private land, such as more of the lakeside and the land in the former golf course. This includes the opportunity to address the reasons why Wimbledon Park is on Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register by Altec, the landowner of the former golf course, working with other landowners, Merton and Wandsworth councils, and the Wimbledon Club, all within Wimbledon Park. And it goes on to quote, to refer to Historic England's representation to Regulation 19, that's in document OD6, which also supports this approach. And it's also explains some key other historical issues which are in the site's design and accessibility guidance, including reference to the views, which is one of the reasons that we're on the parks on the Historic England's Heritage at Risk Register, archaeological heritage. The one issue that's, while it won't address the issue of fragmented land ownership, at this stage now, there are 3 main landowners involved. One is the, as opposed to 4 that there were previously, one is the Altec, which is now the freeholder and leaseholder, if you like, of the golf course. One is the council and one is the Wimbledon Club. And this allocation, and any allocation, doesn't propose to change land ownership titles, but it is representing a massive investment to help these landowners work together better. It helps that we are dealing with 1 land ownership on the former golf course as opposed to 2. And it's clear actually from a lot of the investigation that's been undertaken on the heritage matters that we now have a much clearer picture of all the previous heritage aspects of the park. And I think with Historic England's proposed modification that seeks to make sure that there is a landscape and management plan. I'm just going to quote from it. One moment. This is in OD 13K. So the paper I've just handed around. And it relates to adding information on the design and accessibility guidance, which refers to securing the production of a landscape management and maintenance plan as part of any development proposals that may come forward, to provide a comprehensive plan for the conservation, enhancement and ongoing management of the entire registered park and garden that takes full account of the site's historic development and significance, acting as a common agreed baseline from all parties to work from. And while the allocation involves only the Altec landowners, Altec owned land, it doesn't involve the Wimbledon Club owned land or the council's owned land. It's our view that if this is produced for 1 landowner and there is any change, although none's proposed for the other 2 landowners, that same landscape management and maintenance plan can be used as a point of commonality on this. And it is worth saying that as a council, being the 2nd biggest landowner, and also owning the lake, that this is something that we can take forward without the necessary need for planning permission, and we can start to use those documents without having outside the planning system. Whereas we couldn't force any other landowners to do so, but we could certainly start to do so ourselves.
Okay, Ms. Butler, on that, I'm just looking at the suggested modification from Historic England here on the production of the landscape management and maintenance plan. So obviously that it'll be secured in respect of development proposals of part of the site. So how would that be secured? Would it be through section 106? And if so, is that something that would meet the relevant tests that are given in the framework relating to planning obligations?
Yes, I guess through section 106, and yes, it would meet the 3 tests. especially being necessary for the development. You know, the site is on the Heritage at Risk Register previously, and as previously we've had part of the site managed as a golf course, an active golf course, part of the site managed as a public park, and part of the site managed as a Wimbledon Club. And this introducing a legal requirement on development proposals to use a common landscape management and maintenance plan would help to address the reasons on the Heritage at Risk Register, which are outlined in fact in the paragraph above in Historic England and the Council's Statement of Common Ground.
Thank you. And one other point on that, in terms of the element of the wider site that's in Wandsworth. So am I right in saying that Merton managed that, albeit it's not in their ownership?
Wandsworth is the local planning authority, but Merton managed the whole park because the borough boundary goes slicing right through the top of the park. So Merton Council managed the whole park on behalf of Wandsworth.
Okay, and I'm presuming, Ms. Parsons, that your point is just to add further clarity on the Statement of Common Ground. So I'll invite you in now before I go around the room for other views.
Yeah, if it's helpful, I've got a few comments to make on that. So from our point of view, the management plan is probably the single most effective way to deal with our concerns about why it's on the Heritage at Risk Register in the long term. And we think that modification is crucial then to secure the production of that document and make it clear that that is a key factor in terms of the long-term improvement of the site. In terms of a positive strategy, again, this is where the where a heritage topic paper added to the evidence library would be very helpful. We have identified certain opportunities that the proposals bring forward. Now, we're not talking about the proposals, but these have been drawn out from the evidence that's been done in association with that. Such as desilting the lake, improving public access, undoing other harm, opening up views, things like that. And so we do think that having a policy is necessary to help secure some of these public benefits by bringing it back to why it's on the Heritage at Risk Register, and as a way to secure the production of a management plan. And we think that having a policy then is actually needed to help set a positive strategy if our modifications are considered acceptable, as this would be the best way to secure what we would like the site to deliver in the long term and to secure sustainable redevelopment. And this would be effective in a way that would be much more difficult if the plan was silent altogether on the topic. So we do think it is helpful to have a policy. We do think, you know, in principle, you can do something to this site. Whether or not we agree with the proposals is irrelevant at this point. And as I said, we have got concerns, but part of our assessment as well has also you know, we've identified areas where even more opportunities to address harm could be brought out. And I think the topic paper would be a good way to articulate those a little bit more, and maybe they could be drawn into the plan a little bit more, into the policy once that has been produced. But in short, we think that the policy is needed because that is the only way that we can secure this management plan, which goes to the issue of the fragmented land ownership, and it draws direct attention to the need for development to address the heritage at risk issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Parsons. Okay, so I'm going to bring some views from around the room. I'll start with Mr. Coombe. So I presume you've had an opportunity to look at that statement of common ground now, Mr. Coombe.
Thank you, Inspector. Yes, we've looked at it very quickly. I may need to come back to it, but I would like to try to deal with some quick points on it. Firstly, noting that the key part of the heritage at risk status is that there's uncertainty around the future of the entire historic landscape. And I think we can welcome the desire to have a management plan which is comprehensive for the whole of the historic registered landscape. What is proposed by allocating WI3 only to the golf course and lumping it in with the heavily developed land on the west of Church Road is not that. It would be open to Merton, the Wimbledon Club, and the All England to agree a management plan for their 3 land holdings. That's the first point in relation to this. May I just pick up a point which Miss Butler made about Wandsworth? And there's an error in the Merton replies to your questions. Merton do actually own the whole of the public park that's in Wandsworth. I don't know whether they were aware of that, but frankly, they do own it. They've owned it since 1915. Their management plan might apply to the whole of it. The planning application has to be made to Wandsworth because there's a borough boundary which crosses it. Merton haven't proposed to include their public park in any site allocation. That's all I have to say on that. Thanks.
Ms. Roberts.
Thanks. Yeah. So I wanted to respond to a few points that have come up and kind of bring this back to the justification. So the point there that was made around, the heritage issues around development almost being an enabling development to try to bring investment needed to resolve the at-risk issues seem to be being put in as a justification somehow. Before that, I heard the playing pitch strategy mentioned, which was very strange to me because, of course, a playing pitch strategy is about provision for public playing pitches, and at no time that I've heard has this allocation been anything to do with providing public playing pitches. And even if it had, I haven't seen a weighing up of what kind of pitches are needed. And even then, it's not flat. And I know that usually you would be looking for land which is flat and well drained. I mean, maybe it is well drained, I'm not sure, to meet playing pitch needs. There was also the issue of the open space strategy mentioned, and yet again, this preempts what may or may not come out of a planning application or a Section 106 agreement, and indeed whether that is properly implemented and enforced and so forth, and whether any of the site that is owned by the All England would contribute to open space provision. We don't know that. So, or at least we don't at this stage have security that would be. So it brings me back, and also we have justifications in terms of the need to, the local economy and the status of the tournament, and it just feels like everything is being done to try to justify this rather than the starting points, which ought to be right. We need playing pitches. Let's look at what's available, what we have, what we need. We need open space. Let's look at vote, and we need to look at the tournament and so forth. And so, if it doesn't feel like that's happened at any stage, it feels like what's happening is to try to justify what the All England want. And I don't feel that the question that the inspector originally asked, which is, what would happen if this allocation was not in the plan? What would the implication of that be? But I would like to hear that from the council rather than from the All England. That's it.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you. I must admit to being slightly puzzled by the emphasis on the at-risk state of the park in this discussion about the allocation of the site. It's been suggested that the Historic England put its designation on the park in 2015. I am aware that there have been some discussions since then between the Wimbledon Club and the All England Club. And I understand there's a memorandum of understanding with regard to the at-risk nature. And there have been discussions between Historic England and the All England Club, including the Wimbledon Club, since then, but they seem to have gone nowhere. And so mindful of the grand statements of intent in this allocation and the responses from the council, I have to question the importance of this in the allocation of the site, and also perhaps would like to hear from the All England as to what they've been doing in the interim before making these grand statements. Thank you.
Mr. Steiner.
Thank you. I'm going to address the fragmentation issue. I need put a little bit of background, which I did put in the submission, but very quickly, we established in 2012, that was to bring really Wandsworth residents and Merton residents and others together. One of the first things I did was to ask Merton whether they had a business plan for their park. The answer was no. So we wrote a conservation management plan for the whole of the heritage park. We set up a forum which included all three owners, all the politicians, as many residents associations and other interested parties, including managers and employees and so forth. That still is running. The work that we've done since then is installed blue plaques to each of the 5 entrances to Wimbledon Park. Okay, in the public part, we've planted over 2,000 trees. We've investigated pollution in Wimbledon Park Lake, and that was on Altec and Wimbledon Club land with the Thames Water Environmental Agency and the South East Rivers Trusts. And from that, we suggested silt traps be fitted to the Rushmere, Bigden, Brooks, and the Altec drain. We carried out a bat survey for the whole of the heritage park. And these we have to fund and do ourselves. In 2017, we met Tara Butler and I forget, John Hudson, was it, from Wandsworth, to talk about being a neighbourhood planning body. We wrote this statement of justification, and I think that was approved. It failed on the grounds that nobody lived there. That's not quite true. There are 1 or 2 who do. I've written the comments, when I think Tara wrote them in there, that we could continue to look at policies and draft plans. So we have, for example, the £20 million plan for the stadium. We went to all 3 owners to tell them about this, and Altec, that included Sally Bolton and Johnny Perkins. And certainly we discussed this in one of the consultations as we went round the park, and Justin Smith was there, and it was Ulrika who was talking about it. So it's a live, big project, £20 million, and everybody knows about it. Also, Revelstoke Road plan. We took this applied to Wandsworth and Merton, got planning permission, paid for it ourselves, are having huge difficulties now with TfL, who own the land under the bridge. So it's not true that there are no ideas in the public park. We've also been talking to the Wimbledon Club, and they are quiet on what they're saying, but they know about this and would certainly do that. So I think that sort of, if you like, sets that. On the question of keeping Historic England involved, I regularly contact Chris Lane with details of these projects, so Historic England know about them, knows about our views. Regarding Wandsworth, who are the regulatory authority, I'm in contact with them regularly, and any new developments, I contact the cabinet member for Wandsworth. So link between cabinet member Wandsworth, cabinet member of Merton. So that keeps going. Each year we write an annual report, which includes the whole park, what's going on. So and just before the application, we got together and wrote the vision for the whole of Heritage Wimbledon Park. So it's not true that these haven't been thought about. They have been thought about, and proper plans have been submitted. It's now over to discussion. Thank you.
Mr. Steiner, I'd like to come in here, and I'd like to make a general point to everyone in the room as well. Look, history is relevant. I acknowledge that, but I'd like your view as to whether or not the allocation before us would address the views of the fragmented management of the heritage assets. I appreciate wrapped in that is consideration of what's gone before, but as you can appreciate, we're dealing with the evidence in front of us and as submitted by the council. I didn't quite get from your answer, forgive me, whether your view was whether that allocation, forget whether you think there might be alternative views and so forth, but whether the allocation as proposed and with the modifications proposed by that we've heard about this morning, would the allocation address that fragmented management of the heritage assets? I'd be very interested in your answer on that, please.
Well, my answer is no, it doesn't, because you need to look at a holistic view of the thing. You take, for example, if I've just received this this just put out, development proposal must respect the site's historic setting, including the views to St Mary's. So if you sit on the dam promenade, you don't just see St Mary's church, you see a green sports hut, you see a dome, you see a green space buildings. So the vistas are not being addressed by this allocation at all. You can't sort of do a part, because there are consequences of doing one thing one place and in another. You need to sort of look at what the effect is on the whole. So I'm saying certainly it does not do that. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
No, it does, Mr. Steiner, and thank you very much.
So we've heard Historic England have got this in the statement of common ground. They talk about the production of a landscape management and maintenance plan. So would that assist in some of the objectives that you've talked about?
Well, of course, all I know is the title at the moment. I'd like to know what the content is, and we're more than ready to sit down and talk about these. You know, I've shown you some of the plans. We have extensive written reports, a lot of stuff from Dave Dawson, for example. Neil Thompson, who's a landscape architect, has helped with the plans and things. We've done the bat survey. So all of these things, we need to sit down and talk and have constructive talks.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'll just remind you, Mr. Steiner, it might be the first time you've heard it, because it's quite a new proposal that's come forward and to be added into as a potential to be added into the allocation. So I'll just read what the text that's been agreed between Historic England and the Council. So it says, secure the production of a landscape management and maintenance plan as part of any development proposals that may come forward, to provide a comprehensive plan for the conservation enhancement and ongoing management of the entire registered park and garden that takes full account of the site's historic development and significance, acting as a common agreed baseline for all parties to work from. So that's what has been suggested could be added to the allocation to assist with this issue of the heritage at risk and the fragmentation of ownership. I'm just interested, and we've heard, you know, the very active involvement you've had and continue to have. Would that be something that perhaps would assist? I'm not talking about the wider issues about the merits of what other development might be going forward, but just in terms of that particular aspect.
Well, a quick read, the answer seems to be yes. It's interesting that the 2018 master plan, for example, picks out a couple of sort of land swaps that need to be done and things like that. So getting the owners together with Historic England and the community involved as well, I think that is a way forward.
Thank you. Ms. Parsons.
Thank you. Yeah, just a few points that might be helpful. Yeah, we agree with Mr. Steiner, and we'll be very happy to continue to work with you as things progress to work out the content of this document. But I think the idea that this is to try and deal with conservation and enhancement, to try and rectify past harm, if that's reassuring, that would involve you know, dealing with views that are currently obstructed and things like that. So that is the intention. I think as well, having the conserve and enhance in there really helps hook that in to everything going forward. And just a point on enabling development, we do not consider this to be an enabling development issue. Enabling development involves accepting harm and working on that basis, and we don't think that's the applicant's position, and they're not proceeding on that basis either. Our view is very much that harm should be avoided or mitigated, and that is our interest, is that ensuring the site is conserved. And we think having a policy is better than not having a policy for the site to try and secure things like the management plan itself. We don't think that it's, you know, we don't think that this site should block any development in principle and heritage terms, but we do need to make sure it's managed and delivered appropriately, which is our intention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coombe.
Can I just clarify something? Was Ms. Parsons talking about the current All England planning application?
No, I was talking about the statement of common ground that we've put forward to deal with any application going forward. It's very important that this policy doesn't prejudice one way or the other any planning application that exists. From our point of view, that, and in plan terms, where the current application is relevant is that it, regardless of the outcome and the proposals that have ended up at the end of the process, the working out, the detailed analysis and research that was produced to get to that endpoint is helpful. And from that, we've been able to identify opportunities for potential enhancement. So that, in that respect, that's what we're saying is relevant. It's for the council to go away and try and take their own view and produce a topic paper that can bring that out, which could maybe result in further modifications. But our intention is that this is an objective policy that is robust to cover the life of the plan and deal with any application that may come forward in isolation of this particular application. I hope that helps.
Thank you for the clarification. I'm still a little bit puzzled. Can I just go back to Inspector Aston's principal question? Is the site allocation appropriate? And be quite clear that the site allocation of the existing west of Church Road comprehensively developed All England site alongside the golf course, however protected the golf course is, as Dr. Dawson was saying, chalk and cheese. And I would add that there are probably 4 different types of cheese on the heritage park. There's the lake, there's the public park, and the golf course, which should be taken together. I had understood the statement of common ground to try to urge the council to reach a management plan for the public park that had nothing to do with the All England site on the west of Church Road. So I don't think it really fits with the justification for the way in which WI3 has been allocated. May I just go on to make one further point? What status would this partial site allocation, if the inspectors are minded to allow it, have as regards the rest of the public park, the lake, and the Merton ownership and the Wimbledon Club ownership? I simply don't understand how 3 different landowners could be brought together by this kind of policy, which applies only to one of the land ownerships. It seems to have no legal effect at all.
Ms. Roberts.
Thanks. Yeah, I think our point of view would be that the statement is productive in relation to the whole park, but not something that would ameliorate the issues with the allocation as is. So while we would be happy to encourage what is being proposed for the whole park as perhaps a statement within the local plan, that doesn't mean that we would then say that that would support the allocation as it is. We would not.
Okay, thanks, Ms. Roberts. So what I suggest we do, I'd like to bring Mr. Rolfe here in just for some brief responses to some of those points, and then come back to the council.
Thank you, sir. As you described, we do support the approach, and having read through what is being presented by Historic England and the council, I think we're satisfied with that as an option. I would just reiterate, I think, what Historic England said, that there is good common sense in having this spelt out in policy related to the site. In the absence of that policy, there isn't a coordinated approach. There isn't incentive for the landowner or a landowner to lead that coordinated approach. It is something the club are working on. It is something the club have offered to do and to lead. And I would also point out, I suspect when this process is at an end and that landscape management plan is produced, there will be a capital cost associated with those works that will need to necessarily come forward, because we have identified previously a number of works that will need to take place, not least the desilting of Wimbledon Park Lake, all of which have heritage benefit. And for that reason, I think it is right that it is associated with this site allocation, and we are supportive of that and committed to working towards that approach.
Thank you. So, Ms. Butler, responses to those general points before we move on. But yeah, again, perhaps a response. We did ask the All England Club about it in terms of what if there wasn't an allocation. But if you want to have a response to that as well.
I'll just touch on some of the points and then finish up with the question that was raised. If there wasn't an allocation, what would happen if the site wasn't in the plan? Firstly, apologies to Mr. Steiner. Yes, absolutely, we're aware of the Friends of Wimbledon Park work, and also to point out that they've been very helpful and participatory on the recent lake project to address some reservoir safety issues that has just finished up now. And also to reiterate, as Mr. Steiner said in the Friends of Wimbledon Park statements, that we did meet 2017 about having a neighbourhood plan for Wimbledon Park. But as my colleague in Wandsworth and myself advised, it's tricky because the neighbourhood planning legislation deals with voters and people, residents essentially, and it isn't really appropriate for a park. So Mr. Steiner and Friends of Wimbledon Park have continued in the other vein. So while the council has no plans, we're aware of Friends of Wimbledon Parks. I think you said £20 million significant plans for the public park. And it's worth pointing out that although that's not in the allocation, I think it remains unfunded. I'm looking at Mr. Steiner. If that were to come forward, the same heritage aspects would apply, because that's still in the heritage aspects, in the designated registered park, even though it's not part of the allocation. And the reason the council's land is not part of the allocation is because in the next while, we're not aware of the plans of the Wimbledon, so Friends of Wimbledon Park are fully funded and unlikely to be delivered. That may happen in the lifetime of the plan, and this plan does not preclude that, but there isn't the level of certainty at the moment that allows for an allocation for that significant change to the public park in Merton. Point out that the Wimbledon Park work that was carried out by the council in 2018, it's the Wimbledon Park master plan that the council prepared that we're due to put on the examination library. It looked at 3 options in consultation with residents and all sorts of other community organisations. And the option proposed in the final plan was for a minimal change, because it was clear that at the time, people felt that the public park, they didn't want to see masses of change at that point. I agree with Ms. Parsons, this is not enabling development for the reasons that she set out. The final question, just to say as well, sorry, we have a statement of common ground with Wandsworth, OD 13B, which does refer to our engagement with them on site WI3, while, as Mr. Coombe correctly points out, council own the land, Wandsworth is the local planning authority. And therefore, we need to, well, of course, we need to engage with them on the duty to cooperate as well. And that's at paragraph 5.48 and 5.49 refers to our most recent engagement on site WI3. And finally, what would happen if the site wasn't in the plan? Well, I mean, All England Club will still be there. They've made it clear for years, and we support the overarching principle that this is one of the world-renowned championships, and this sporting organisation is going to continue in that vein. It would give less clarity and certainty to anybody knowing where the site was involved. We're all bandying words around like Wimbledon Club, Wimbledon Championships, Wimbledon Park, and having an allocation in the plan helps us to secure some of the key points that we feel it's just more difficult to secure simply through the planning application process. It's more difficult to negotiate. It's generally more difficult for people to know what could be happening on a site if there is no allocation. As with any local planning authority and any local plan, sites are allowed to come forward and come forward all the time without an allocation. Most of every borough sites are what one might term windfall sites, whether for housing or sports or whatever. Not having an allocation doesn't stop development. It doesn't stop change. And it doesn't prevent it either. but it does make it harder to secure key points, such as those to address the reason the park has been on the Heritage at Risk register for over 5 years, and the sporting legacy and the extra access to the land that's being private golf course ownership. So I suppose if it came out of the plan, it would make it more difficult for us to secure the benefits that are necessary, we believe, for the area.
Just that final point that Mr. Coombe raised in terms of the allocation relates to one landowner of that wider site, but then the management plan, the landscape management plan is going to deal with the whole of the heritage landscape. So his view was, how could that be effective? We've already heard your views in terms of how a planning obligation might be used to secure that, but have you got any further views on that at this stage?
Yes, I mean, the most robust way of securing that is through a planning obligation, and that was only applied to where planning permission was necessary. So we have 3 landowners at the current time: the All England Lawn Tennis Club, the Wimbledon Club, and the council. Should development proposals go forward, and this is obviously, this would only be secured if development proposals went forward, such a management plan will be secured on the land to which the development proposals applied through a Section 106 agreement. And in the case of the council, it is in our interests from our public duties to see Wimbledon Park removed from the Heritage at Risk register. So while the council has no significant plans for a planning application on the whole of its public park, it is the council's prerogative, and it is within the council's gift to secure to apply such a management plan on the land that it owns and manages. Finally, that's the Wimbledon Club. And as referred to widely in the room, we'd hope to work with the Wimbledon Club to persuade them to take on elements of the landscape plan. We couldn't force them in a planning sense unless they apply for planning permission. I must be clear on that, is that we wouldn't have a legal possibility that I am aware of through planning to force a landowner to which planning permission didn't apply to take it on. However, if they were applying for planning permission for any aspects of their site, this is where the legal obligation would kick in, and at least there would be a plan that would be drawn up with them to manage that, so that they would be aware that they would need to take on board. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Just one final point on this, please, Mr. Coombe.
Just a final point. I think I heard Ms. Butler to say, perhaps we need to be clear about this, that if the All England comes forward with a planning application, and if this statement of common ground is inserted into the site allocation, it would not be required to secure the engagement of the Wimbledon Club or Merton. So I come back to my main question: how can the requirement for a tripartite management plan be enforced unless Merton would be saying to the All England Club, you cannot proceed on your land without bringing the other 2 landowners, and we've heard that Merton may be acquiescent, fine, without bringing the other 2 landowners on board. That seems quite harsh to the All England Club, frankly.
Thanks, Mr. Coombe. Just final point, that's a technical point, perhaps, but it's an important point in terms of that, you know, the wider management. So have you got any views on that at this stage, Ms. Butler?
Just to say, I don't know that it's possible legally in planning terms to require a landowner, applicant, or somebody to, you can require them to engage, but you couldn't require them to make issues that other landowners that they do not control do something, I just don't know that that's legally possible. If there were bigger plans that the council had to develop their aspects of Wimbledon Park, for example, if the 2018 council master plan had, instead of voting for minimal, instead of arriving at minimal change, if there had been a groundswell of opinion that thought that maximum change was possible, then it may be that our allocation would have included the council's land at least, but that's not where we are. And I'm not aware of any planning mechanism that could force anything other than landowner A to engage with its neighbouring landowners. They couldn't force them to make them participate. Otherwise, nothing could happen for landowner A.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Coombe. So yeah, so I mean that's something that we'll reflect on when we're taking into account, particularly the contents of that statement of common ground and this allocation more widely in terms of how effective that might be. Inspector Aston, you want to go in?
Thank you, Inspector Fort. I was just going to add, just following on from Ms. Butler's point, it's a general comment just about the language and the wording that's used in that proposed modification, securing the landscape management and maintenance plan. I acknowledge what she's just said, and obviously we'll reflect on that. There may be an opportunity, Ms. Butler, to look at the wording, clarity, the language used. You know, I will always pick up on words, you know, phrases like full account. You know, what does that mean? Common agreed baseline for all parties to work from. There may be something in the language of that comes out of some further discussions after this hearing session, which may not totally overcome Mr. Coombe's quite important point, but may assist in trying to find a solution and moving forward. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Ms. Parsons, have you got a final point, just particularly on the management plan?
Yes, thank you. I'll be quick. The intention behind this modification isn't to block one party from doing development over another. It is to establish a shared baseline that applicants in the future coming forward can show that they have used to inform whatever development or maintenance strategies that they are then putting forward. So we see it as a tool to inform what happens next, rather than rather than trying to preclude one person doing something over another. We agree, you know, there's always room to refine language. I think it would be difficult to specify, as Ms. Butler said, specify particular individual landowners in a policy, because that relates it back to the current circumstances in the current planning application, where this isn't intended to do that. This is meant to be an objective policy that would need to work if any of those ownerships changed over the plan period. So it would be difficult to tie that in, and not necessarily achievable through planning anyway. But what is achievable through planning is the production of this document and its intended use, which is a baseline from which everything else would then stem from. It's not intended to be obstructive. It's just to get that commonality that then informs what happens next. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coombe.
Thank you. I'll try not to detain you any longer. Mr. Aston suggested to Historic England and to the council that they might like to think again about the drafting of that statement of common ground. Can I just ask if there'll be an opportunity for us to have a look at it and be consulted on it, or will it come up in October perhaps?
No, I'd hope it. I mean, because this is in train now. I think the usual guidance on statements of common ground, because these can be quite fluid documents and dynamic, is that we require them generally 5 days before the hearing starts. But because this one, you know, is already substantially there, but it needs perhaps some revision, I'd anticipate that it will be ready in good time ahead of the next stage of hearings. Well, thank you. So there's a range of different views. I think it's fair to say on that we'll have to consider as the examination goes forward. And obviously we've got this additional topic paper that will be coming in ahead of the stage 2 hearings, which we'll have to take into account. There'll be opportunity for further discussion on that at stage 2. So I think I intend to leave specifically the heritage aspects there for now, before we move on to the metropolitan open land, the discussion of that in particular. So, Inspector Aston, were you going to start off on this, or was it me?
I'm happy to, Inspector Fort. That's fine. So, okay, this is in relation to our issue I questions 3 to 5. And to Miss Butler first. We spoke about the mould designation for the site as a whole, and that the plan intends to remove an element of the site to the west of Church Road from metropolitan open land. And you may recall we discussed a session last week how this could be, and these changes more widely could be more clearly articulated in the plan, and whether exceptional circumstances support the amendment of the boundaries as proposed. So kind of we move on a little bit to discuss in more detail the interaction between the allocation and the area of the site that would remain in Mole, and about whether it's justified, consistent with the London Plan and national policy, and to what extent it's effective. Is the allocation effective because of its Mole designation, given the restrictions posed on development within metropolitan open land?
Thank you, Mr. Aston. Probably pass over to my colleague Kate O'Donnell as part of our response. And inspectors, I'm just going to ask for clarity. On our statement under paragraph 14.9, we have 2 maps that propose the mole changes. Is it helpful if we share screen so that all participants, both in the room and outside the chamber, can see this? It is part of our statements and part of documents, the submitted plan, and part of document 18D3. But I think reading through all representations, there may have been some confusion as to whether we were retaining metropolitan open land on Wimbledon Park, which we are. So if it's okay answering Mr. Ashton's question, would it be advisable that we share the 2 maps under paragraph 14.19?
Yes, please. Given that it's material that's already before the examination, and yes, I mean, we did discuss, didn't we, last week, how the clarity of the plan generally in terms of mole revisions. So so just following on from that and taking that into account. But yeah, it will be helpful for this hearing if you could share the screen.
Thank you. Just to say that the image you're about to see on screen is from the policies map submitted to the inspectors. It's also contained in document 18D3, which is on the examination library as a summary of all the metropolitan open land changes included in this site. And it is in our hearing statements under paragraph 14.19. So as a starting point, just to say that the council proposes a small amount of metropolitan open land removal. You'll see, so for clarity, the 2014 is on the left, 2021 is on the right. We were proposed to retain Wimbledon Park and metropolitan open land. For clarity, the top half of the park is in Wandsworth Local Planning Authority, and that's also proposed for retention in their local plans as metropolitan open land. as part of cooperation, we've established that. And yes, we believe that the retention of metropolitan open land on the Wimbledon Park site is effective, justified, consistent with the framework and the London plan, and it's effective in terms of the allocation as set out in our response to question 5 in our hearing statements. It is likely that very special circumstances would have to be established to justify any built proposals on metropolitan open land. And we believe that the site allocation sets out an effective approach to this, and that it would be for applicants to justify the very special circumstances for built development. It is fairly common practice, as we've discussed, for other site allocations in Merton's local plan, that sporting uses do occur on metropolitan open land. And at this point, I'll just ask if my colleague Kate O'Donnell wants to add anything, if that's okay.
Thank you, Ms. Butler. I think Ms. Butler has touched on the main elements. I think the reference that she was making to sporting facilities being appropriate on metropolitan open lands in the national planning policy is paragraph 149B. Obviously, that is referring to green space. Sorry, that is referring to the national policy on greenbelt. But for London, it is widely known through the London plan that metropolitan open land is considered in the same vein. I just wanted to put forward one matter to the inspectors that follows on from our discussions from matter 5 last week. In one of the other site allocations, we proposed, I think it was the Tooting and Mitcham hub, that it would be more clear and more effective to visually represent what the metropolitan open land is on the site allocation map in the actual site allocation itself. And I think looking, kind of taking into consideration your questions and our statement responses and statements from others in the room, it would definitely be more clear to everyone involved and to a decision maker to illustrate that not only on the policies map in 0D2, but also in the map at the top of the page on the site allocation. So that's a proposed modification that I'd like to put forward today. That's not in our
Here they are, Ms. O'Donnell. I think I get the gist of what Ms. O'Donnell says, and it follows on from what we said last week about the Tooting and Mitcham site, that it would be useful and bring it into line with the framework, particularly what it says about Greenbelt in terms of those revisions. And of course, as Ms. O'Donnell said, the national policies relating to Greenbelt are applicable to metropolitan open land. So I think just to develop our Inspector Aston's opening point a bit further there. So I'm thinking about the effectiveness of the policy more generally. The golf course element of the site is expected to be retained in Mole. So just a reminder of what paragraph 149 of the framework says. I think the relevant exception to this. So it says, a local planning authority should regard the construction of new buildings as inappropriate in the green belt. So exceptions to this are, amongst other things, the provision of appropriate facilities in connection with the existing use of land or a change of use for outdoor sport, outdoor recreation, cemeteries and burial grounds and allotments, as long as the facilities preserve the openness of the green belt. So for green belt, read Mole, and do not conflict with the purposes of including land within it. So just thinking about that sort of conceptually, what sort of things might this allow without having to go to a very special circumstances case.
Sorry, Inspector, I didn't quite catch that last sentence.
Okay, yeah, so just thinking about that paragraph 149B of the framework, so that talks about, it's a horrible phrase this, but development that's not inappropriate within the green belt, so it's applicable to Mole. So thinking about that, what and sort of a conceptual stage, I don't want to bring this back to the planning application because, you know, we're talking about the soundness of the allocation. So what sorts of things might that allow? Does it allow for the activities that are already going on the site that we've heard about, you know, and the temporary sort of activities, or is it something else?
I'm conscious of also not straying into planning application territory here, so I'll stick to the principles that we considered when allocating the site. What we're referring to here is grass court tennis largely. The allocation relates to the use of the championships, which is a grass court championships. And with grass court tennis would come appropriate facilities, a bit like at the moment the golf club has a clubhouse. There may be appropriate facilities that come with grass court tennis. I think if the allocation also recognizes the global importance of the championships and the importance of the championships to London's social and economic structure, and also Merton's and Wandsworth's on a more local level. But it is the case that any facility, any building would have to be tested against this MPPF paragraph. And it would have to demonstrate, if it wasn't in conformity with MPPF paragraph 149, whether or not there were circumstances that that overrode this. The key point again is openness as well. So it's not just the fact of a building, it's also the structure of a building and other issues like that. I'm going to try and invite Ms. O'Donnell to come in, but I'm not sure if she's available. Afraid Ms. O'Donnell's internet seems to have died.
Okay, but thank you for that, Ms. Butler. I think perhaps this goes, we keep getting back to this chalk and cheese element, don't we? So with it being quite, it's these two elements of the WI3 site. So we talk about, you know, the significant international sort of dimension of the championships and the economic benefits and all this sort of stuff, and that's related to where the main existing activities are at the moment, isn't it? So it's how does the policy, I think, reflect those two different elements. There's some that's got, there's part of the site that we've talked about that's going to be removed from the mole because it's got that developed character now. You've told us, but then there's part that's going to remain in the mole. So does the policy need more nuance, I suppose, in terms of what's going to relate to those two sites to guide, to be an effective guide for development?
I think just to come in on the back of that, Inspector Fort, I think that's an important point because, for example, you know, does it reflect in the policy about the development proposed? And I'm not talking about the application. We've already heard about master plan and what is proposed. But for example, things like show courts versus the temporary structures during tournaments, the level of activity on a site is also relevant to considerations of openness. So it's those sorts of issues really. And you know, it's all about that kind of, is it effective as a result, and does the allocation make those considerations clear from my point of view. Thank you.
And I just think, just for the benefit of the hearing, for those who are perhaps not as familiar with the framework in terms of the green belt. So paragraph 148 says, when considering any planning application, local planning authorities should ensure that substantial weight is given to any harm to the green belt. So very special circumstances will not exist unless the potential harm to the green belt by reason of inappropriateness and any other harm resulting from the proposal is clearly outweighed by other considerations. So that's the balance that a planning authority would have to do if they considered a development proposal to be inappropriate development for the purposes of the green belt. But for green belt, if you read mole in this case. Ms. Butler.
Yes, we'll reflect on those issues raised there, considering temporary and permanent structures that facilitate the operation of the championships as the tournament that it is. Also draw attention to timescales as well, where the championships operates really in a very intensive way for a relatively brief period of the year. And grass court tennis itself isn't a year-round operation, so the nature of the site will look different as it is existing on Rains Park, which is also part of the Altec estate, also currently has grass courts and is active at certain months when grass court tennis is played, and not so much. That looks completely different in the winter. So we'll reflect on those particular issues. Just to say, Miss Adon is back, but as she missed the original questions, I will leave her out.
Mr. Steiner.
Yes, a brief comment on the sport. One of the things that we have observed is that until recently, it was all participation sport. And the big change is a move to spectator sport. It has been touched on earlier, but I think that's a very big change. And it's been said, obviously, it's a sort of 3 weeks a year or thereabouts. Thank you.
Thank you. Inspector Aston, any further questions on MOLFI on what we've discussed thus far?
No, not from me. I think we can, the kind of second part of this is, does the allocation set out ways in which the impact of removing land from the mole can be offset through compensatory improvements to the environmental quality and accessibility of the remaining mole land? That's the final question just on this particular matter. Miss Butler or Miss O'Donnell? Miss O'Donnell, you have your hand up, so perhaps we'll come to you first.
Thank you, Mr. Aston. Please let me know if my connection is okay now. I've just turned my video off to help matters. I hope that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So this question is question 5 in response to matter 5 from last week, but it also obviously touches on matter 14 as well. So we did have a very brief discussion last week about this. Upon review of the MPPF paragraph 142, as set out in paragraph 5.52 of the council's response to matter 5, the council has reviewed the MPPF on the matter of compensatory improvements and is proposing 2 modifications to 2 of the site allocations in the plan, and one of those allocations is this site WI3. So the proposal is set out in main modification 9.5A, and I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I will just touch on it. It basically sets out that proposals for this site must also include improvements to the environmental quality and the accessibility of the Wimbledon Park Metropolitan Open Land. So that is obviously the entire Wimbledon Park Metropolitan Open Land. And it also identifies that the green infrastructure study can be used as one of the ways in which appropriate landscape, visual and biodiversity enhancements could be identified for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Saldonal. Did anyone in the room want to comment, Inspector Fort? Or?
Yes, Dr. Dawson.
Yes, there's 2 points here, I think. One is that I'm not talking about the planning application. We're talking about, however, grass courts are there as seen as being what may happen across some parts of this site. Now, we were urged to believe by Ms. Butler that these are not a year-round operation. They are. They're very intensive. Apart from anything else, there's hardly any level land. You've walked over this land. So to begin with, to establish them, you've got to cut and fill, and you put a concrete skirt around them. So that's there the whole time. So that landscape change is permanent. But when you look at the operation, these are very intensively managed. You have to keep foxes and geese off them. So you'll need some kind of protection around them year round. You have to manage that grassland very intensively to bring it up to the right standard at the right time. So that involves not just doing it during the time you're playing sport on it, that involves intensive operations throughout the year. And you have to deal with the damaged courts after you have used them and bring them back into condition for the following year. So there's absolutely no doubt that they're a year-round intensive management. The second point was on our biodiversity, and I think here we have a very similar point. We have here at the moment a site of BERA Grade 1 importance for nature conservation, which has 4 national priority habitats on it. So it supports a wide range of biodiversity. I don't think there's any debate between us on that, but the grass courts are not going to be helpful to that. You have to keep biodiversity off them. Indeed, you can't have biodiversity anywhere much near them. If you have too many trees near them and you've got leaf fall, for example, or worse, branch fall, you have a management problem on these grass courts. And if grass courts are a predominant part of the land use on this open space, it may not quite get as far as being built development, but it has many of the same harms that would be caused by intensive built development on this sort of place. Now, it's up to you to judge whether you should see this as built development or whether you should see grass courts as open space use unimpeded by buildings. But I think it's coming up towards the margin. And I think there could be an argument that grass courts should be seen as buildings, not as open space. Whether or not they are, there's no doubt that they do not benefit the landscape nor biodiversity character of the site. You don't benefit the landscape character of the site by cutting and filling across it. The more cutting and filling you do, the more you harm the site. I'm not saying how much will be there. I'm talking about forward planning here. I'm not talking about the planning application.
Dr. Dawson, just coming back on not on the grass quarter buildings. That's a point for another day. Essentially a matter of fact and degree, like a lot of things in planning. But I just want to explore just a little bit with you, given your experience and a comment that you made. In your experience and your view, are improvements to environmental quality where you've got this type of development with the grass courts, you're saying that really, would you qualify that by saying, well, you're only kind of skirting around the edges or it's limited? You mentioned leaf drop on courts. You know, do you have any kind of suggestions or ways that potentially that environmental quality and the enhancements to biodiversity could be secured, given the intended master plan? Obviously not anything to do with any scheme you've seen as part of an application.
No, there's none. If you have a modern grass court, it's incompatible with landscape and biodiversity. So it's only elsewhere in the site. So we're talking about enabling development here, not about forward planning. Yes, with enabling development, you might be able to get off-site improvements. But I don't think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about forward planning here. And in forward planning, grass courts just simply are incompatible. We have old soils here. We have an historic parkland, which includes not just the old trees, but it includes the grassland matrix in which they sit. And the only way, I think, is in the vision that my colleague here, Nick Steiner, waved in earlier, an alternative view of how you could develop the whole grade 2-star landscape. There, the proposal is to put grass courts entirely on the land currently owned and managed by the Wimbledon Club, because that's about the only level land which is already in intensive use for sport across this site. And there you could put grass courts on without much decline in the landscape and biodiversity quality, because that hit has already been taken.
Okay, thank you. Just before we probably come back to Ms. Butler, I'm interested if Mr. Rocher or any of his team have an alternative view just on that specific point.
Well, I think first and foremost, I would respond, and thank you for the opportunity to do so, that of course this is firstly a matter of principle. The principle in terms of planning policy, both the MPPF and also the London plan speak as a acceptable use being open air facility. I'm quoting from policy G3, apologies. Open air facilities, especially for leisure, recreation and sport. That as a matter of principle is something supported in MOL. I did point out earlier, and we'll do again, that the Bank of England site where qualifying currently takes place is metropolitan open land, includes a series of courts, grass courts there, all within those aspects and fulfilling those criteria. So in terms of an acceptability in principle, then the proposal for tennis infrastructure as a principle is acceptable in policy terms. I accept that obviously the manifestation of that needs to be properly considered and weighed up. And that is what the planning process will be there to do in terms of planning applications. But as a principle, sport recreation is supported. Separately, I think it's worth pointing out that the allocation is an extensive land holding, not only including the All England Club, but also the golf course. The golf course in itself is a big parcel of land. The intention, and again, without straying into the planning application, but even if you accept qualifying as a small part, the requirements for qualifying tournaments on that land, the requirements for other tennis facilities would never and would not at the moment cover that land holding in its entirety. However, the benefit proposals do. And the opportunities for improving biodiversity, which we say we can achieve, the opportunities for improving access, the opportunities for improving recreation within the whole of the landholding all exist. So again, I think the policy in itself has some important aspects in relation to that and the opportunity to do that. Yes, tennis is grass courts are well maintained, as you'd expect for a global tournament. But in fairness, the golf course is also heavily managed. Tees and greens are well managed. And if you travel down there today, you can see, in essence, the difference between that part of the land no longer used for golf and that which is. And the level of management that goes into that in terms of pesticides and all the rest of it. We think we'll be reducing harm, in fact, improving biodiversity opportunities by and through the opportunity for improving tennis facilities on the site. And I know there may be some disagreement of that within this room, but that is our intention, and that is the process that we're pursuing. Okay, thank you, Mr. Rocher. Ms. Butler, did you want to wrap up with any final comments? Unless I've just seen a nameplate go up out the corner of my eye, Inspector Fort. So I want to say that.
Ms. Roberts, if you'd like to come in, please.
Thanks. So I wanted to comment on the proposed boundary change to the east, which I'm not actually clear if this is a boundary change relating to the need to change boundaries because of development, or whether there is a justification for doing this in terms of the need for development. So if it's the former, then I don't understand, because it is open green space by and large. But if we're talking about removing this from metropolitan open land, leaving aside the fact that it then splits up two bits of metropolitan open land, so they become disconnected, what this does is to open the way for development on that site, obviously. So the relationship between this and the other bit of MOL, the big bit in the park, seems to me to be that if you move practice courts, or you create space for practice courts on the bigger bit of MOL in the park, then you don't need that site for practice courts, so you can put a stadium on it, basically. So the issue here, to me, goes back to paragraph 141, which talks about have all to change the boundaries. So before concluding that exceptional circumstances exist to justify changes to boundaries, the strategic policy making authority should be able to demonstrate that it is examined fully all other reasonable options for meeting its identified need for development. So I think what I'm getting to here is that if all of this relates back to the need for practice and qualifying courts, and for this to happen in the context of an English garden, then why have we not seen alternatives looked at? And indeed, there are sites nearby within 15-20 minutes drive, which may, be able to contribute to meeting that goal, possibly even better. I mean, the Bank of England Club is actually more like a garden in many ways. It's much more open, it's surrounded by trees, it feels much greener than the current site, which is of course necessarily a lot of hard standing. So the current tournament site is a lot of hard standing. So so I go back to that, and the principle that we need to have looked at alternatives and options and thoroughly looked at all of those before making boundary changes. Thanks.
Thank you. So perhaps a bit more, we've discussed the justification. So Ms. Roberts has brought that point up, in terms of the alternatives, and particularly that interplay with paragraph 141. But just generally, Ms. Butler, in response to those issues we've heard, have you got anything further to add?
Inspector, if it's okay, can we briefly show the map again so we know which area we're talking about? Dealing with Ms. Roberts' point first about the metropolitan open lands removal from the practice courts, I will stress that it wasn't a proposal that was derived from a potential development. It was derived from, as we discussed last week, some site assessments. And I might ask Ms. O'Donnell to briefly talk through the green infrastructure study and the subsequent review of information in there. I will also point out briefly that that's the highest part of the site, and it's really near back gardens. It's not quite obvious on that map, but it's really near people's back gardens, and it's the highest point of the site. So we're not aware of, while we're not aware of development proposals, it would be very challenging, we believe, to develop on that part of the site, given its significance in terms of the conservation area and other aspects. On the issue of biodiversity, yes, we also believe that the allocation has the potential to bring biodiversity gains, and that's set out, as my colleague Ms. O'Donnell mentioned, in his reference to the green infrastructure and biodiversity and open space study. The golf course itself currently is intensively managed land. It has trees planted to create fairways and sand bunkers and very mown parts where the tees are and where the greens are. It's certainly not a biodiversity friendly landscape at the moment, and there is definitely scope to improve on that for any proposals moving forward. Finally, on the point that was made about active and passive sports, I think I'm using different terminology, but the fact that the golf course is allowing people who are members to play sport, and the tennis is allowing professionals to play tennis, but not general club. The site's proposals were considered carefully with Sport England and the national governing bodies for sport. We prepared the playing pitch strategy with them, and that's in line with Sport England's guidance on how to prepare playing pitch strategies. And the group that prepares it is made up of the national governing bodies for sport, Sport England and the council. And that was started in 2017 and finished in 2019. It looked at the site, and as my colleague Ms. O'Donnell mentioned, we have support from Sport England, both in that strategy, but also as a statutory consultee at Regulation 19 of this plan. May I ask Ms. O'Donnell just to come in on the finer points that Ms. Robert raised about metropolitan open land or anything else?
Thank you. Just to pick up on a point that Ms. Roberts raised earlier in the session, which we didn't comment on yet, and this leads on from the discussion just now on the playing pitch strategy. Just to be clear, the playing pitch strategy and the process that we undertook with the national governing sporting bodies and Sport England, it considers all playing pitches in the borough regardless of their ownership. So it's not something that only looks at council-owned sites. It's not something that just looks at publicly accessible sites. It looks at everything, and it weighs up the needs and the supply within the borough and within the surrounding areas and the surrounding boroughs. So while the Altec site obviously is not available for public tennis, there are other elements of the Wimbledon Park which have tennis courts on them, and those were considered as part of the playing pitch strategy. And I mentioned earlier that it's not a key point for the site allocation, but it is part of the evidence base, is the fact that it was agreed by the playing pitch strategy steering group that the Altec sites should be recognised for their international sporting significance. So that kind of refers back to the conversations we were having before. I'm not going to add too much more on the metropolitan open lands, because I think I may have missed some of the discussion earlier, and I don't want to repeat this. Just to say that exceptional circumstances take into consideration wider elements of the plan and not just open space. So I mean, obviously the site being of a significant sporting, having a significant sporting contribution to not only Merton, but also London and the world essentially during those 2 weeks of the year. That is a consideration. It's not the only consideration that was taken. It's just to point out, yeah, the culmination of a number of different elements kind of has informed the metropolitan open lands assessment in this regard, and on many other sites as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Coombe.
Thank you. Can we still show the shared screen, please? Because I think we understood last week that we would come back to this section as a WI3 matter rather than as an MOL matter, if you like, although it's an MOL matter. Are you able to show it through your inspector? It's a kind of a spot the difference puzzle, isn't it, really? I notice the regulations require overlaid plans rather than side-by-side plans. Could Ms. Butler help us, please, or Ms. O'Donnell, as to what the GIS report recommended be excluded from metropolitan open land? Not what the council wants to exclude, but what the lengthy 6-version, heavily consulted 3-year report recommends, please.
Are you able to help with that, Ms. O'Donnell?
Yes, sorry. I'm not going to read from the report, but as a general summary, the consultants, as part of the site assessments they undertook for all of the open spaces in the borough, this was obviously one of them. They recommended that the northern part of the site, which contains buildings and structures and built form, they recommended that that be removed from metropolitan open land, but that the remaining open spaces, the green spaces, be retained. And as we discussed last week on the matter 5 for general metropolitan open land matters, the green infrastructure study was the starting point for the council's assessment on mole. It wasn't the be all and end all, and we didn't agree with every single recommendation that came forward from that plan. The council undertook our own site assessments, and we also took into consideration site-specific information that came forward over the period since the green infrastructure study was published until the local plan was prepared and then subsequently published for consultation. So the council then, upon reviewing the site, upon visiting the site on a number of occasions, it is our opinion that the portion of land on the 2021 policies map that has been removed from the Altec site, it's not physically or visually connected to the wider metropolitan open land for the Wimbledon Park. There's a clear and defensible boundary that runs through the Altec site, essentially down Church Road. It's not contiguous with the mole on the other side of Church Road, and we're of the opinion that that part of the Altec site has more of an urban function, it fits in more with the urban neighbourhood to the north, which is the residential properties. And we came to the conclusion that the removal of that portion of the site wouldn't harm the wider mole function of the Wimbledon Park.
Thanks. So in short, Ms. O'Donnell, what was the reasoning behind the green infrastructure studies recommendation for that particular piece of land? I recognise that, you know, there were these further assessments that you did following that, but could you just give us a summary of that, please?
Yeah, just in terms of this site, I believe that their site assessment was that the built form on the site didn't meet the mole criteria, but the rest did in their view.
Thank you. Mr. Coombe.
I'm sorry to have to come back on this, but I just don't understand that explanation. The section that's being removed is not built upon, it's practice courts. It's very open. We've just heard a powerful argument on behalf of the All England that practice courts and grass tennis courts may well exist in metropolitan open land. I don't understand the removal. Can I make a separate point that the only justification, as I understand it, you need to seek a plan that is sound and justified. The only justification in the documentation is not that the GIS study, a very full 350 plus pages, extensive study, must have cost a fortune to produce it, but it's because the council visited the site and thought it might be a better idea to remove it, as if I paraphrase the explanation. Can I just also ask how much of the site to the west of Church Road is being removed from metropolitan open land? As I understood the appendix to the council's answers on matter 5 questions, it was 2.5 hectares. Can I just check my understanding?
In response to Mr. Coombe, yes, that is what the appendix says. Those measurements have been taken from the council's GIS mapping system. And in response to your point on the fact that that land has no buildings, it does in fact have some buildings on that land that have come forward over, I don't know, a number of years since the previous plan was adopted. This map that's on the screen may not show that, because obviously the overlay of the boundary shows some built form there in the kind of in the stadiums and the centre court there. So please don't take the map on the screen as being what is there on the ground today. But when we did undertake our site visits, there's definitely some built form there in that northern section.
Okay, thank you. We've got that. We've got where your evidence is coming from. We've got your point, Mr. Coombe. I can see you, and we've said we will undertake another site visit. So taking all of that into account, I've got the views on that. I'm conscious it's 1:30. It's time for a break. Are we okay to leave these additional points till after lunch? Dr. Dawson? Mr. Roche? Yeah. Okay, so I think we'll adjourn now and come back at 2:15, please.